Hello, everybody. My name is Brenna Cleary, and I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator at the Hauenstein Center. Welcome to today's Coffee House debate on the subject, should Michigan raise the minimum wage? Before we get started, I want to give a special thanks to Grand Valley and all of our donors, especially our benefactor, Ralph W. Hauenstein, and our community partners such as the Dire Eyes Foundation. Today's debate is part of the Hauenstein Center's Common Ground initiative, which is unique in higher education today. No other public university is working to offer a balanced, comprehensive exploration and redefinition of what it means to be progressive and conservative in the 21st century. Our Common Ground initiative reinforces the Hauenstein Center's mission to raise up a new generation of men and women committed to ethical, effective leadership and public service that Ralph W. Hauenstein exemplified in his life. And now I'm going to introduce the Hauenstein Center's program manager and today's moderator, Chad Dowd.
Cool. Thank you, Brenna. For today's debate, we're going to be running with Yannet Lathrop and Jarrett Skorup. Yannet Lathrop joined the Michigan League for Public Policy in 2012 as a state policy fellow. She holds a Master's of Philosophy in Political Science from the New School of Social Research, which she achieved in 2010, a Master of Information in Information Studies from the University of Toronto in 2011, and a certificate in labor studies from the City University of New York in 2006. She has also worked as a shelter coordinator for Casa de Esperanza, a shelter for battered women, and as a social work advocate for Vision Services for the Blind. Yannet also served as an intern for the offices of former U.S. Representative Martin O. Sabo, a Democrat from Minnesota, and the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, where she worked as a communications and media outreach specialist. We also have Jarrett Skorup, who is a research associate for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He is a graduate of Grove City College with degrees in history and political science. He also studied economics and religion. Skorup is the content manager for the Michigan Capital Confidential, and his writings have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, MLive, Detroit Free Press, Detroit News, Orange County Register, Daily Caller, townhall.com, National Review, and many newspapers across the country. The format for today's debate will begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. Both will have 10 minutes each. Following that, we will move into a rejoinder or response section where each debater will have 5 minutes, and then we will have a period of 10 minutes where each debater will have pose questions to the other. From there, we'll take questions and responses from the audience for our panelists, and then we'll close out the event from there. So to begin, Yannet, if you would like to begin with your opening statement of 10 minutes.
Sure. Right here? Oh, okay. Well, thank you for coming here. I know it's sometimes difficult to get up in the morning, but so I am here. Can you guys hear me? No? Can you hear me now? No? Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now? All right.
9 minutes left.
So I am here to argue that it's time to raise the minimum wage and to index it to inflation. It's been almost 6 years since Michigan's lowest paid workers received a pay raise, when in 2008, the minimum wage went up to $7.40 an hour. Since then, the prices of food and consumer goods have gone up each year. Corporate profits have shot up and broken historic records. Productivity has increased, but the paychecks of low-wage workers have shrunk in real terms. As a society, we can and must do good by our low-wage workers. We must reward their hard work and give them a much-needed and much-deserved pay increase. An increase to this wage is not only good for low-wage workers, but it's also good for the economy, which would see a boost as a result. And it is also the right thing to do. You've probably heard this before, but it bears repeating. Everyone who works hard should be fairly compensated. That is regardless of age, education, or marketable skills. That is a principle that has driven much of the labor policies that gave us workplace protections that we enjoy today. Our current minimum wage of $7.40 an hour is not fair compensation, and I will tell you why. Consider this. The Michigan League for Public Policy estimates that in 2011, a wage of $10.80 per hour for an individual and $21.30 per hour for a single parent raising 2 children were needed for these households to meet their basic needs without having to rely on public assistance. This estimate is based on measures such as HUD's fair market rents, the USDA's cost of food, and measures that are widely accepted among policymakers and researchers. If you did some quick math in your head, you've probably already calculated that $7.40 an hour is about $3.40 below what is needed to meet the basic needs benchmark for a single individual, and well over $10 too low for a family of 3. A wage of $7.40 an hour nets just around $15,400 annually for full-time work, and that's before payroll taxes are deducted. It's no wonder then that a recent study found that 73% of low-wage workers or their families are enrolled in public assistance. If the current minimum wage fails to boost even a childless individual above poverty, is it a fair wage? A minimum wage that pays poverty wages is not fair compensation. A wage that pushes families to seek public assistance after putting in their 40 hours of hard work is not fair compensation. Keeping a wage so low because it is claimed to be earned mostly by teenagers working for pocket change, as my debate opponent might suggest later, is that the opposite of fair and is not even a reflection of today's reality. In fact, in Michigan, 85% of workers who earn at or just above the minimum wage are at least 20 years of age or older. Nationally, the average age for these workers is 35 years old, and there are more 55-year-old workers working for these wages than there are teenagers. In Michigan's average ages for these workers is very similar. Further, 86% of these workers have at least a high school diploma. 82% work at least 20 hours a week. In fact, 44% work full-time. Almost 1/4 of these workers are already parents raising about 500,000 children. Does that sound like teenagers working for pocket change? I say no. In any case, what is fair compensation is paying a wage that rewards hard work regardless of age, education, or skills, and gives families a chance to live without fear of falling into poverty. I know what poverty looks like. I'm originally from Peru, and I grew up there during Peru's toughest economic times. When inflation was rampant, jobs were scarce, and hunger could be seen in the faces of far too many children. Back then, Peru was a surreal Dickensian world, and I do not wish that on anybody. America's poor do not suffer as Peru's poor did back then, and hopefully they never will. But having seen abject poverty, I grow very concerned when news stories and reports constantly suggest that we are on the wrong path as a nation, with ballooning inequality due to shrinking paychecks for the many and increasing wealth and record corporate profits for the few. A better balance needs to be struck, and it needs to be struck soon. Not only to prevent working families from falling into poverty, but also to help speed up the pace of our recovery. That's where an increase in the minimum wage comes in. There are federal and state legislation that propose to increase the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour and $10 per hour, respectively. If either is enacted, that would mean a modest but desperately needed wage increase for over 1 million of our lowest paid workers in the state, who currently struggle to keep their heads above water. An increase would bring the minimum wage closer to what it should be, not only for the sake of self-sufficiency, but also to undo the effect of inflation on the real value of the minimum wage, which has dropped 20% since its peak in 1968, and which will drop another 15% by 2022 if we do not increase it and index it to inflation. Further, and this is where the minimum wage is of benefit to more than just low-wage workers, a modest increase in the minimum wage would not hurt businesses, but would have a positive impact for Michigan's economy. This is because when low-wage workers have a little bit more money in their pockets, they tend to spend it right away, and mostly at local businesses on things that they need, such as food, clothes, medicine, school supplies, gas, and childcare. That increased spending boosts the economy, and over time it leads to higher demand for workers to staff those businesses and to create more of the products being consumed. In fact, if the minimum wage was raised to $10.10 an hour, as per the federal proposal, Michigan's economic activity would increase by $1.09 billion over 3 years, and this could create about 4,600 full-time jobs. Though it might seem counterintuitive that increasing the minimum wage is good for businesses, business owners themselves understand the benefit of a healthy minimum wage. In a recent survey conducted by Small Business Majority, more than 2/3 of small business owners expressed support for increasing the minimum wage and indexing it to inflation, with nearly 4 in 10 strongly supporting an increase. Another 2/3 of them also agreed that bigger paychecks would lead to increased demand for their goods and services and to a general boost in the economy. Lastly, 2/3 of those surveyed also believe that a healthier minimum wage would decrease pressure on taxpayer-financed government assistance. On this last point, I should add that in Michigan, an estimated 52% of fast food workers or their families receive public assistance, costing the taxpayer approximately $251 million each year. What this means is that the taxpayer is subsidizing the labor expenses of profitable businesses to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars annually. I'd like to close my opening remarks by saying that we need an economy that works for everyone, including our lowest paid workers. Building such an economy takes commitment on the part of elected officials, the business community, and all of us. Increasing the minimum wage so that hard work is fairly compensated is a first step to building such a fair economy. And I say that not just for the sake of fairness, but because prioritizing the interests of businesses at the expense of workers will hurt us all in the long term. However, if we maintain a better balance, our prosperity as a society can be more sustained, helping us weather even the toughest economic times that are an intrinsic part of our capitalist business cycle. Is there still some time?
There is.
Okay, well, I'd like to read you a little quote by the owner and CEO of Four Seasons Christmas Tree Farm. And I think she makes really very good points, her as a business owner, about the minimum wage. She writes that today, and she's speaking about the federal minimum wage, she writes that today $7.25 an hour minimum wage befits Scrooge before he saw the errors of his ways. It amounts to just $15,080 a year for full-time workers. Workers shouldn't have to depend on food stamps or food banks to put Christmas dinner on their tables. If I don't pay my employees a decent wage, they won't have money to spend at other businesses. And if other businesses don't pay their workers a decent wage, they can't afford to buy my trees, and I can't afford to hire more employees. That's a negative cycle instead of a positive one. And she further writes, at the end of A Christmas Carol, Scrooge doesn't just give Tiny Tim's family a turkey, he gives his family a raise. And I think her words are actually a pretty good reminder of the necessity to have a minimum wage that is healthy, that will help the economy and that will help workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Yannet. Jarrett, your 10 minutes for response begins now.
Well, I disagree. There's two main reasons to be against minimum wage laws, in my opinion, or as I like to refer to them, rather than minimum wage, government-mandated price controls which prevent private citizens from engaging in mutual beneficial exchanges with threats or threats of jail time. The first reason is that it's bad public policy and will likely do more harm than good. Among the most basic laws of economics is that if you make something more expensive, you will have less of it. Minimum wage laws make hiring someone more expensive, and thus you'll get less of it. Or else the cost of that higher wage will be made up somewhere else. As the economist Thomas Sowell notes, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Some of the trade-offs, so the solution would be a higher minimum wage. Some of the trade-offs would be less workers, less lower-skilled workers, higher prices, less additional incentives for employees, like bonuses, less break time during the day, perhaps making workers pay for their equipment and uniforms, etc. But whenever there's a government solution, always try and picture what the trade-off of that solution might be. The second reason is a moral one, and that is if two people come to an agreement affecting only themselves, what business is it of government to tell them they can't do so? So to put this in more plain language, this is kind of an example from the economist Russ Roberts. Suppose you're at a coffee shop, you see a 20-something-year-old young woman. She's obviously poor by American standards. Perhaps she has broken English and is accented. She has no certifiable job experience, and she applies for a job and is rejected. So, with entrepreneurial gumption, she responds to that rejection by offering to work not for the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, but for $5 an hour. You see that the manager is interested in this counteroffer. He thinks about it for a second or two, and says, "Look, it's against the law, but yes, I can hire you for $5 an hour. So you're hired, but please don't tell anyone because I'll be in serious trouble and you'll lose your job." Now, if you witnessed that scene, would you personally intervene to stop this woman from taking the job? Would you personally go up to her, look her in the eye, and tell her, "Sorry, you cannot work for that wage"? Would you personally inform her, with regret, that she must remain unemployed for the time being and look for jobs elsewhere? And would you personally be willing to use force to prevent the business from hiring this person for $5 an hour? Now, almost everyone understands, or should understand, that in a free market, wages are not arbitrary. Government cannot just set a wage with no negative results. They're set by the marketplace. Most people understand this because probably most people in the room have worked at minimum wage or under minimum wage at some point in their life, and perhaps even make more than a minimum wage today. So having a low-level job is an important way to gain knowledge and experience and move up in the world. And we're not just talking about $7.50 or $7.25 at McDonald's. What about, say, unpaid internships? Perhaps maybe even the Michigan League for Public Policy has those. Here in Michigan, every congressman that voted for the federal minimum wage hike has unpaid interns. So why do congressmen who are mandating higher costs for businesses get to escape by not paying their interns? It's a question to ask. So everyone starts out somewhere in a job, but politicians can make it more expensive to give someone that start. And if the government says you have to pay someone, say, $15 an hour, which is a popular minimum called for nowadays, and the employer does not believe the person's worth that amount of money, then they will not hire them, or if they have someone they believe is worth less than that wage, they will fire them. And this disproportionately affects lower skilled workers who need to start somewhere to move up in the world, who are trying to get a start. And it also disproportionately affects minority workers. As the economist Thomas Sowell I quoted earlier notes, the last year in which the black unemployment rate was lower than the white unemployment rate, 1938, was also the last year in which there was no federal minimum wage. Today, the unemployment rate for black males is 44.3%, while for black male teens is 44.3%, and for white male teens is 19.8%. So the question is, if we were to hike the minimum wage another 25%, say to $9 an hour, or 100% to $15 an hour, which group would be would be more likely to remain unemployed? And if you think hiking the price of something does not, in this case, the price of workers doesn't matter, then you should ask yourself what you would do if your local gas station hiked its prices 25% or 100%. My wife drives across town to save a few cents per gallon, much less if it was hiked that much. Now, when we're talking about hiking the minimum wage, don't be under the delusion that it is big businesses you are only hurting. Certainly in fast food, a lot of those, which are a lot of jobs that are meant to be temporary and starting jobs, yeah, that would affect those. But there are lots of large corporations who could really care less about hiking the minimum wage. Consider the fact that the CEO of Walmart and CEO of Costco have each actually advocated for a minimum wage hike. Why is that? Why would the CEO of Walmart or Costco want to hike the minimum wage? Sure, if Congress hike the minimum wage a certain amount, it might cut in those businesses' bottom lines a little bit. But Walmart pays $10 to $13 an hour. Costco pays $17 an hour. So a hike in the wage, while cutting to them a little bit, will harm their mom-and-pop competitors. And that's where the bulk of people working in those areas work. They work at minimum wage jobs for small mom-and-pop and local businesses. Now, the basic fallacy of believing that government can hike a minimum wage without effects on employment or in other areas is the idea that wages are arbitrary and can go up and down at the whims of politicians. But that is not true. Having a minimum wage is not some radical idea meaning that a country is destined to be poor backwater places. Indeed, the United States did not have a minimum wage until the late 1930s, decades after we were already the richest country in the nation. In fact, in Western Europe, of the 18 countries, there are 9 countries that have national minimum wage legislation, and there are 9 countries which don't. The 9 which do have minimum wage laws have a jobless rate of 13.8%, and the 9 that have no minimum wage have a jobless rate of 6.3%. Now, correlation is not necessarily causation, but the fact remains that just because countries without a minimum wage, like Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, did not cause them to become these economic backwaters immediately with no, businesses or jobs. Hiking the minimum wage and having a minimum wage cuts the rungs off the bottom of the income ladder and prevents a lot of people from getting a job, starting out, and moving up in the world, like many of us in this room. I won't necessarily go into a lot of the statistics of the people who do make up minimum wage. I think some of that is mostly irrelevant. I mean, a lot of them tend to be younger workers, people starting out at their first job. But the point is, if you're going to hike a minimum wage, you make it less likely for a business to hire someone that they perceive as low skilled. They're more likely to keep on people who have higher skills. So I would disagree that just automatically causing a hike in the minimum wage means that you're giving a raise to lower wage workers. You also could be giving them a pay decrease if their job is eliminated.
2 minutes remaining.
That's okay. We can move on to the whatever the next segment is. So, thank you.
All right, so at this time, Yannet, if you'd like to give your response, 5 minutes, please.
Okay, so a couple of things. Well, I'm going to start with the idea that hiking the minimum wage is that big box stores don't really care, that they would not be as affected and only small businesses would. As I've already mentioned, there is a study that suggests that small business owners are already, a huge percentage of them are already in favor of raising the minimum wage and indexing it to inflation. And what I did not mention is that about 85% of those small business owners already pay their workers above the minimum wage. So even though they want to see a stronger minimum wage, they believe that it's the right thing to do right now to be paying their workers above what's already required of them. So I find it hard to believe that just because Walmart might have in 2005 or 2006 been okay for I think it was a couple of months or something, for PR purposes it seemed, have advocated for an increase in the minimum wage, that all of a sudden they're, that's evidence that they're favor for the minimum wage just because they want to have more competition with small businesses, as I think my opponent was trying to say. I don't think that's the case, and the evidence doesn't support that. Another thing that I wanted to reply to was the idea that workers, unskilled workers, teenagers, a lot of minority workers would be priced out of the labor market because they're unskilled and because owners might not consider them to be worthy of an increased minimum wage. As far as I have been able to tell, looking at the evidence, when the minimum wage is increased, the employment effects hover around zero. So that means there's no significant increase or no significant decrease in unemployment. And that is the same, as far as trends are concerned, the same is true for young workers. From the period 1979 to 1989, when the minimum wage went down in real terms, its value decreased in real terms. There was, again, no evidence that suggested that young workers were necessarily negatively affected. The evidence suggests that there was no real employment effect, even for them. So again, hard for me to accept the idea that workers, especially unskilled workers such as young people, would be affected by an increase in the minimum wage that is very significant, that is very worrisome. It just does not seem to be the case.
Okay, let me break that in a few different areas. In the first part, you mentioned about these businesses, 2/3 that would advocate for a higher minimum wage. So they want a higher minimum wage. I guess my question is, why are those businesses not, why would they advocate for that? Why would they not just simply pay their workers more? If it's good for the economy, if it's good for workers, if it's good for them, why don't they just pay them more already? Why would they advocate for the government to come in and mandate a higher minimum wage for everyone else?
They are already paying their workers
Right.
more. 85% are already paying above the minimum wage,
Right.
above
So-
the mandated minimum wage.
Right, exactly. So if the government came in and mandated a higher wage for their other businesses, then that would give them even more of a competitive advantage, perhaps. Because if they're already paying higher, then it helps them out, which was the point I was making with the Walmart example. If Costco's paying people $17 an hour, well, hiking the minimum wage from $7 to $9 an hour, that's not really that big of a deal. But if you're making workers more expensive for your competitors, well, that could harm them. That might mean they have to raise their prices, which means you have more people coming and at Costco. So I was just making more of the point. It's not that these businesses are advocating for a higher minimum wage in general. They're saying they want everyone else to have to pay a higher minimum wage, because they could easily go ahead and do it if it was just up to them. On the other point, in terms of whether minimum wage leads to unemployment, what would happen if the government hiked a minimum wage, say, to $50 an hour?
Well, nobody's advocating that, so that's sort of a ridiculous
Right, but hypothetically,
assertion.
what would happen if government did that?
At that point, I'm sure that inflation would be an issue, and so would be unemployment. But that's, again, not something that anybody's advocating.
Right. No, and I understand. I'm just the point I'm trying to make is we agree that at some point government can hike a wage, which will have negative effects. Now we're just disagreeing over what point that happens. I'm saying it happens anytime you do an arbitrary wage, there's going to be negative effects. Now, I agree, too. $50 an hour would be a lot worse effects than if it was $15 or $9 an hour. But either way, I agree with you. There are going to be some negative outcomes.
So are we still on the back and forth?
Let's go into the question
cool.
section, back and forth.
All right. So I would like to then ask you, it seems like what you're saying is that you're opposed to having a mandated minimum wage period. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So, hypothetically speaking, if we abolish the minimum wage, what's to stop employers from paying wages that are so low that they are basically hovering around zero? What is to prevent us really from going back there, from going before protections for employees, for workers, before, well, I don't want to necessarily make this, an exaggerated hypothesis, but we could really be going, if that were to be the case, towards a reality that resembles many of Dickens' plots in his stories.
Well, that's a great question. So I live in Midland, Michigan. Midland's home to Dow Chemical Company. Dow Chemical starts their engineers about $60,000, $65,000 a year. They're not mandated. Hypothetically, Dow Chemical could pay their engineers $7.25 an hour. So why does Dow Chemical not pay their employees $7.25 an hour?
You tell me.
Because there is competition for those engineering jobs. They need engineers, so they're forced to pay them more. That's why these professors here at Grand Valley State don't make minimum wage. There is competition for those jobs. There's competition for all jobs. I mean, I think most of us can agree some jobs in the marketplace are worth more than others. If you're an oil and gas engineer right now coming out of college, you're starting at $120,000, $130,000. Now, that's not because oil and gas companies are very generous people that just want to help out those employees. That's because they have to pay them that much or else they're not going to hire them. There's competition for those workers. There's competition for all workers, and that's why wages are set by supply and demand. In terms of the hypothetical of working back to a point where people are so poor, well, I think the example of the countries that don't have a minimum wage, some of which are very rich, and also the case for the United States, which did not have a federal minimum wage until 1938, and yet has been a very rich country, that lends credence to the example that wages are set in the marketplace rather than by government fiat.
Well,
Can I get a question in?
Sure.
So at one point you talked about how I think it was 1978 or what the year was for the
79.
peak. 79.
Oh, sorry, for the peak in the minimum
For
wage?
the peak, right.
1968.
Okay, so 1968, that was the peak of minimum wage, which is a date that is picked, by proponents of hiking the minimum wage because it shows that, yes, in real dollars, the minimum wage has decreased 20% since then. But why the first minimum wage was 1938, and that minimum wage in today's dollars, why would we not use the example of 1938 and say what the minimum wage is today? Why pick, for example, that year, that 1968?
Because it's problematic that we have allowed the minimum wage to decrease that much since its peak. It makes sense to look at the peak rather than the starting wage.
Right, yeah. I mean, because 1938 adjusted would be about $4 an hour today, so we actually have increased the minimum wage far above that. But the other end of it, and this maybe we can find some common ground on, since 1968, we've also increased other subsidies to poor people, like the EITC, certainly on the federal level. So, from my standpoint, my own opinion, rather than saying, okay, we want workers to make more money, we want to keep people off poverty, which we can all agree with, and saying we're going to run that through by mandating higher costs on businesses, then I would say that if the government wanted to do that, they should do it through a cash subsidy or an EITC or some type of program. Just take taxpayer money, say we want to help people, and give it to them that way. If you run it through businesses, you get distorted incentives. You can cause higher unemployment for some groups and lower for others, and so that's personally just where I'd see like that's a more inefficient way of doing it.
I did hear about the EITC proposal, and I don't think that you need to choose between a higher minimum wage and the EITC. It makes sense to keep both. It makes sense to have an increased minimum wage and an EITC that promotes and rewards hard work. You don't really need to choose between the two. That would be my response to that. As far as the idea of supply and demand and whether that we should just let the market forces set wages. Since you quoted somebody earlier, I didn't catch the name, but since you quoted that person, I'd like to read you guys a quote. This is by somebody who I won't disclose his name just yet, but he writes, "But there's no market in the state of nature, just survival of the fittest. A society necessarily determines how the market is to be organized. Standards of morality and decency play a large part in those decisions. We set minimum standards for worker safety and consumer protection. We decide young children should not be in the labor force. We do our best to prevent certain things from being bought and sold. Every society must necessarily decide for itself what decency requires. That's the very meaning of a society. Don't ever fall for the assertion that the market knows best. Markets are human creations requiring human beings to decide how they are structured and maintained." And I think that actually is a very good reminder that the market that we consider to be, and there is such a thing as supply and demand, yes. I mean, we are within capitalism. We live here in this type of society, and there are those laws that do govern the business cycles, the runnings of capitalism. But let's not forget that the market in which the supply and demand rules exist, those are creations that we've made, and we can make those changes to it to make sure that not everyone is not a tiny group of people are benefiting to the expense of everyone else. By the way, and maybe this will be something that you will consider to be not the best person to quote, but the person that I quoted is Robert Reich. And so I think, at least in this quote, he makes total sense about the limits of a market, especially with regards to protections for those who need it the most.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess my comment on that would be that governments are also a man-made creation, and of course, government does not always operate to just do the good of society. Politicians have incentives just like we do, and one of those incentives, of course, is in calling a minimum wage, perhaps, which is politically popular, would be re-election. So perhaps they're not doing it necessarily for the best of people. I think people are, generally they want to help other people out, but they might have other incentives as well, and that's why you see different advocates of minimum wage, some for $9, some for $10.10. In fact, our president went from $9 to $10.10 over a period of a couple of months, and then some up to $15 an hour. Suggests that this is kind of a relatively, arbitrary number. I guess one question I'd ask is, are there any jobs worth less than $15 an hour? I don't know exactly what minimum wage you're advocating for, but less than $15 or $10 an hour. Are any jobs worth less than that?
That's not up to me to say. I don't put. I'm not the one praising things, and
Right.
I would not want to be the one saying that the work, the very hard work, the very needed work of some workers are worth less than $7 an hour or $10 an hour, or what
Right,
it
sure.
may be.
And my point on that is, we all do make that decision, though. I mean, me and my wife, we have a 15-month-old, so occasionally we get a babysitter or something like that. Well, if the government said you have to pay $15 an hour or whatever price you want, well, we would go out less, if we had to pay $15 an hour than if we had to pay the girl who lives 2 doors down and is perfectly willing to do it for $7 an hour or $5 an hour. I think there are, lots of jobs, depending on the demand of the marketplace, are all worth different amounts of money, and I think that it's better left to individuals to figure out what that's worth rather than the bureaucrats who are really disconnected from the situation just arbitrarily saying here's how much somebody has to make.
I still disagree. I'm sorry. I don't see how just leaving it off to somebody to decide to shake hands and say, sure, I'll pay you $2 an hour in this type of economy is a good thing. I'm sorry. There are protections that must remain, especially for workers, unskilled workers who could be the most vulnerable in this type of market. I don't think it would be fair for business to profit so much and pay their employees so little to basically ask them to live way below the poverty wage just because the worker's so desperate to get work, and the business owner knows it and is willing to exploit them to that extent. I think those are very worrisome consequences of removing a minimum wage or of lowering or just leaving the minimum wage to erode because of inflation. I think I'm sorry. On that point, no common ground.
I want to thank both of our debaters for giving us an opportunity to hear from their perspectives. At this time, we'd like to pose an opportunity for questions and responses from our debaters from the audience. So if you have a question in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand. Brenna Cleary will bring you by the mic, and she'll hold it for you.
I think, this is Mike. Is there any hard data for either one of you that demonstrates what you read all the time, that if you raise the minimum wage, it will cost jobs? You referred to it sort of in your principle that if you it'll do more harm than good, because if you make something more expensive, you get less of it. Is there hard economic data that either one of you can cite that that's right or that's wrong? If we raise the minimum wage, is it going to cost a lot of jobs or any jobs? If we lower it, or forget lowering it, if we raise it, is it going to cost jobs? Can either one of you cite any data that proves that?
Yeah, I mean, there's evidence on both sides of this, and it's really complicated to draw it out. Alan Card and Card-Kruger study is one that a lot of minimum wage advocates, which tended to show that they studied restaurants on the border of 2 states, and one state that raised the minimum wage, and looked at employment, and they did not find much of an effect. David Newmark, who's done a lot of work, more on the side against minimum wage, has said yes, if you do hike it, it does have employment effects. The reason the data is hard to fledge out is because even talking about this, less than 3% of workers make a minimum wage. So you're talking about a very small segment of the people who are working in society and trying to flesh it out. But, as we said before, she agrees with me that if you hike the wage that you do have employment. She just says, if it happens at $50 an hour, maybe it would happen. I'm saying maybe you're not going to necessarily have job losses, but the business is going to make that up somewhere, either by raising prices or, they're not just going to take a flat loss and say, I might not be able to make payroll this year. They're going to make it up, at some point.
And on that point, actually, so this is a calculation that I found, and a good one, I think. A minimum wage increase of 10% could mean a price increase of maybe 1 to 3%. So that means, for example, that a McDonald's dollar menu burger, which costs you right now $1, might cost you $1.03. It's it's a price increase that a lot of us can take, and it's a price increase that is unlikely to make a lot of employees lose their jobs. And the proposal here in Michigan is to raise it from $7.40 to $10. The federal level is to $10.10 an hour. That's about a 35% increase. And again, that means that maybe a dollar menu burger might cost you between 3 and 9 cents extra. So that, again, it's sort of, it's hard to imagine that type of increase would really affect the work of a lot of people, a lot of workers who work for these places, at McDonald's and other fast food places. Or, by the way, fast food industry is one of the biggest employers of low wage workers. So that's a good estimate to look back at McDonald's and see how the prices there would be affected. And I will say that a 10% increase in the minimum wage is estimated to reduce poverty by about 3%. So that's actually a pretty good return for investment if you think about it in those terms. So the price increase part, it seems like it's not something that we really need to worry about. For as far as the employment situation of some workers, again, there are studies, and my opponent has already mentioned, there are studies that suggest that basically when you look at the range of studies for and against, you continue to see that the effects on employment hover around 0. So they really don't have a huge effect either way, positive or negative. And one of the studies actually wanted to understand why that happens. And they found that there are channels of adjustment that employers use that might have something to do with why there isn't a huge effect on employment. And those channels of adjustment include requiring more productivity of their workers, basically meaning if you show up on late a few too many times, you're going to get a warning, and you're probably going to be one time laid off, if that were to happen. But there's that one part of the channel of adjustment that makes sure that workers are producing as much, so that makes up for some of the pricing for the cost of labor increases. There are some price increases, and I already mentioned how that would affect a place like McDonald's. It's just not going to be a huge amount of money. Either they can have that come out of some other profit, which probably won't be a huge chunk either, or they can pass that on to the consumer. And again, it's not a huge deal for a lot of people to pay just a few more cents per burger. There are other channels of adjustments that include limiting or waiting to increase the pay of their highest paid workers. There are other ways of dealing with that, and let me see if I can find in my notes. But another one that I wanted to highlight is increasing marketing to expand sales. And also, one of the things that was also found in this study was that higher consumer demand from an increase in paycheck of these workers is also expected to partially offset the increase in labor costs employers. So the more that regular workers have money in their pockets, they're going to use it, and they're going to use it to buy things in the economy. That really boosts the economy, and in the end, that price increase does not really mean a huge loss for employers either. So there you go. There are some channels of adjustments that prevent the decrease in employment, and that is probably why, and I can't say that for sure, but this is probably why, according to this study, you don't really see much of an increase or a decrease in employment.
But those channels of adjustment, we can't control them, right? So they could be, again, I am hugely in favor of increasing the minimum wage, but Those channels of adjustment could be what he referred to, paying for uniforms, losing breaks. So it could have a detrimental effect on the worker itself, because we can't determine what those channels of adjustments that business will choose to take.
Exactly. Those are businesses that would need to make that choice. And there could be some that decide to let go of some of their workers. But again, the evidence, and when you look at the larger evidence, what it suggests is that it doesn't really have a huge of an effect on employment.
Well, not employment, but they could get the quality of life of the employee, like losing breaks, like getting the money by paying for your
Right.
uniform.
And the other thing,
Kind of thing.
and the other thing, I mean, all of what you're talking about, that's decisions businesses wrestle with every day. Should I increase the price of my burger 3 cents and pay workers 35% more? I don't know if I'd agree that they can quite do that. But why does the burger place not do that if they can pay them that much more? I mean, they're wrestling with that all the time, which is why not every single worker that works at McDonald's makes the minimum wage. They obviously value some employees or some managers higher than others. All businesses do. But they're sorting that out every day in the marketplace. Maybe I have to give them longer breaks to keep them on. Maybe I have to pay them more. I mean, employees want all kinds of different things, not just higher wages. If everybody only cared about higher wages, then every single person in this room would be an oil and gas engineer, like I talked about. Probably nobody is. And that's because we all care about all kinds of different things, not just a straight higher wage.
Well, I would say that I don't know if the losing of breaks. There are some, mandated workplace protections that require some breaks. So I don't know that the quality of the work environment would necessarily decrease because of an increase in the minimum wage. There are some good rules, some good protections out there for employers for a reason. So that's a good thing. As far as everyone becoming an engineer, well, supply and demand, that little pesky thing. I'm sure that if everyone was an engineer, you would be paying minimum wage to a lot of those guys because everyone would want to work there.
Common ground. Jobs are different.
Okay, there you go. We found something.
We have time for one more question.
I've read several conservatives who make the argument that we should raise the minimum wage to save money, et cetera, from the money we spend on people that are making minimum wage currently that still need food stamps, et cetera, that they can't make a living, and you had mentioned that. I just wondered, from a conservative point of view, what is your opinion about that specifically?
Right, yeah. I address this a little bit, yeah. So if we want to help, if we say we want government programs, we want to use government and we want to help poor people, we want to keep them out of poverty, then I don't see why you're going to go through and say, okay, well, we're going to make this, because we know there's distorted incentives somewhere. I mean, that's the basic of economists. If you pass a law in business, something is going to change. It might change for the better overall. Sometimes it might, sometimes it won't. But rather than saying, okay, well, we're just going to make these businesses pay them more and then deal with, unemployment or these other areas where it's negative and then also do those government programs. I would say then just argue for a minimum income or something like that. That would be the most efficient way. Then you're giving them directly the money. They're going to go spend it, in the economy. Then you're not dealing with all these types of business interests. And also, if you had, say, that example of a minimum income, then companies would have to raise their wages, of course, if they wanted lower wage workers, because then they're competing with offering them a job versus that type of supplemental income that you're getting from the government. But my overall point is just it's very inefficient to go through and do it through all these regulatory different ways. It also allows, you have to hold for minimum wage means something very different in New York City than it does in rural Michigan. And so it's very complicated. It's very, politicians can use it to their advantage for different ways, and they're very self-interested. So I would say, yeah, if you're gonna talk like, well, we need a higher minimum wage to make up for those subsidies, I'd go the opposite direction. Let's not do the minimum wage, and we'll do work subsidies, because that's just a lot easier to do, and it's easier to have that debate, and then you don't have all these variety of different programs that you're trying to institute.
I disagree. I do disagree for a few reasons, but I don't know that we do? Okay. Well, the idea of a guaranteed minimum income sounds like a block grant to me, and that doesn't always work for the benefit of the many. At least if you consider block granting some of the most important aspects of a social safety net, when you have a block grant and there's no flexibility for need, there's no flexibility for inflation adjustments, etc. It does sound like a block grant. I would need to actually read up a little bit more on that idea. But one of the things that Jarrett mentioned was the EITC. And again, that is a benefit that is accrued to workers, to people who earn some money. And yes, that's obviously the reason. It's an earned income tax credit. And that works well. It really does actually help people. If it helps family's income get a little bit of a boost. Again, though, you really don't need to choose between those type of income enhancement programs and minimum wage that actually reflects the realities of today, what it takes to feed a family, what it takes to live without having to fear poverty. And that's just something that, as a society, we really need to consider. We cannot continue to see record profits for corporations and continue to oppose the increase of a minimum wage to a level that is just a very, very moderate. Still, $10 an hour is not a lot of money. It's not. So it's a little bit over $15,000. Imagine being a parent having to raise a kid on that type of wage. It's impossible. I don't know that I could do it. Not that I have kids. I have a cat, but that's something else. I don't think I could do it without having to go to the government and say, I need food, I need medical care for my kid. There are so many things that we as taxpayers are financing. We're subsidizing these businesses' labor expenses by keeping a minimum wage so low that these families have to go to the government and get their basic needs met that way. Talk about inefficiency. That is inefficient.
Right. But on the other hand, it's even harder to raise a family if you make $0 an hour because you lost your job because you mandated this type of hike. But I think you're making it very complicated. So then just tax those businesses more. Not that I'm advocating this, but if I'm on the left, then tax those businesses more and give the money to those.
Don't give us any ideas.
Yeah, right. Well, Michigan League might like both those ideas, but
personally, I wouldn't mind.
But they do pay their interns, so that's good.
Yeah, actually we do.
Which our certain gubernatorial candidate does have some unpaid interns, so that's kind of an interesting. I guess I'm interested if we have one minute. So what do you think? Should unpaid internships be allowed? What do you think of the politicians who vote for higher minimum wage but offer unpaid internships?
Bad guys, I don't know.
Well, we'd like to thank you two for coming out. We have Hauenstein Center gift bags for both of you, and thank you everyone for coming. We have evaluations on the chair, and we highly encourage you to fill those out and put them on the back table, where we also have a lot of Hauenstein Center literature for you. Thank you.
Thank you.